Chair, and thank you, Minister, for your answers. Great to be here. Really keen to have a good, robust discussion with you about this bill. So, because I missed the first part, I'm going to start, but just cut me off if this has already been covered, because thankfully there's lots of areas that we can go into. So, I want to ask a question about the evidential basis behind this bill, because from following this bill through the select committee process, it became apparent to me that it seems like there was a decision that you arrived at, Minister, that you decided no cause evictions coming back to New Zealand. Yeah, as you do, as you're the Minister.
Just point out as part two, if we can keep to part one.
Yeah, I guess the evidence that I'm talking about underpins every part of this bill, so that's...
Okay, well, it's fair to ask about evidence, but if you're referencing things, make sure you're in part one.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I guess focusing on the evidence behind part two, this part in the bill.
Part one.
I want to understand how you arrived at this bill and what evidence underpins these particular parts that we are discussing currently. Because to me, it seemed like you had an objective that you wanted to achieve, but then it seems that we've worked backwards to find the evidence to create the basis for the bill. And so what I want to understand is, what is the evidence? Because in my view, the regulatory impact statement that underpins this bill and these parts was like uncharacteristically not as detailed as other RISs that there have been prepared by the officials, and I felt the evidential case wasn't particularly strong, which is unlike that particular ministry. And so, yeah, I would love for you to stand up and tell us what the evidence is behind it, particularly given that there isn't a lot of support for this bill, with 97% of submissions being opposed, and then is it 53% of property managers and landlords being opposed to this bill as well. So if there's not the support there, not this kind of overwhelming call from landlords and property managers for this, then why was this pursued as a political objective if that evidence is not there? So I think you get what I'm getting at, so I'll give you a chance to respond.
Well, Mr. Chair.
Honourable Minister.
The members talking about stuff in part two were actually on part one, but I'm happy to address the point. If we want to do it as all parts as one. No? Okay, well, okay, well, I'm going to be... Well, not really, because you're basically talking about... okay, the evidence for pet bonds, which is part one, the evidence is really clear, and I think the member would probably agree with me, that there are a lot of tenants who wish to have a pet who can't have a pet. I think most reasonable people realise that's been a bit of a gap in the law. The law's been unclear. Probably most people would agree it's been too hard to have a pet, so the evidence underlying it is that we want to make it easier, and I think most people broadly accept that. And the member wasn't here, but we've traversed the provisions around not being able to unreasonably withhold consent, and the quid pro quo of that being that you've the ability to charge up to 2 weeks for a pet bond.
Tamatha Paul.
Isn't it? Aren't you not supposed to mention when a member is and isn't in the House?
Oh, don't worry about that one. That's just waffle. Interesting point from Tamatha Paul. I mean, you don't want to have, say, Chris Bishop and Wainui Marta kindly asking a constituent while door knocking, can I please use your toilet, and have your anti-national landlord sit there and boot their tenant with a no-cause eviction because Chris Bishop used the toilet.
I mean, that's kind of funny, but I don't think a landlord's going to be booting you because you invited a Tory into your house. Like, if we're going to be frank, right? Like...
Well, you never know. I do know one particular flat that my friend Tony lived in. They got kicked out because they were gay. Because the landlord was a homophobe.
True, that's back on the table now.
And that and got away with it because of 19-day no-clause evictions back in 2016.
Yeah, right. Now it's pretty.
Yeah, so I mean, if you can be kicked out for being gay, you can be kicked out for leaving Chris Bishop to use your toilet. It's very plausible.
Kicked out for any reason these days.
Yeah, well, imagine that if that was like, having an anti-national landlord kicking out the tenant.
Just quickly too, like something interesting that Kiwi said there in the chat. So what the law was, or it has been and still is, and is going to be added to, is that you could collect a bond for a pet. However, it was that your total bond could not exceed 4 weeks. So I remember when I first entered the rental market, the usual standard was to get around like 2 weeks, so like the first week of rent and the last week of rent. And then once the amount was raised so that you can collect up to 4 weeks of rent, part of the reasoning behind this was so that you could allow like things like extra bond for a pet. The way that the rent-seeking establishment took this is, we'll just ask for 4 weeks.
Yeah,
because why not? And so having a part of the bond specifically dedicated for pets, like I'm not going to say that's a bad thing in the sense that what probably should have happened is when this practice changed from 2 weeks to 4, it should have remained as the first and the last week of rent being the bond. And then you could do another 2 weeks on top of that specifically reserved for pets. But because that was not done, you now have these situations where people are, if you want to have a pet, you're going to have to pay 4 weeks of rent plus another 2 weeks of rent on top. It's kind of absurd. But what are you going to do about it? The other thing too that's really troubling about this, right, is like, yeah, no worries, Kiwi, is like if you have a tenancy currently, right, and your landlord really doesn't want to give you a pet, right, or allow you to have a pet, but like technically the way the law is written, they shouldn't have reasonable grounds to refuse. But if they really don't want you to have a pet, they could just so happen to evict you without cause, without notice anyway. So like even this idea of like, well, landlords aren't allowed to refuse a so-called reasonable request is still in and of itself absurd. Like just the number of absurdities that swinging the pendulum this far in this particular direction creates is just totally out of whack. Like again, I could have some sympathy for some argument that perhaps things were a little bit too much one way before, but the answer to then take this nuclear option, like I don't know, I'm profoundly disappointed, but unfortunately not surprised.
For me, no clause evictions are used as a thing of I can't be bothered keeping paperwork, but I want to be able to sit down there and kick people out when they do something wrong without actually following due process.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the thing that comes in there. Like, like put it this way, you can't sack an employee for a no-clause employment termination. It's not...
unless they earn over $180,000, which is the Brooke Van Belden thing that...
yes, that's very new. But pretty much basically, like, you can't be sack someone in that. Like, if you have a contract with, say, you've got a 9-year P-time contract for bus... for running buses. In the case of Wellington, Transurban, what's the current name of Kinetic? If it's Kinetic, which owns NZ Bus. You've got Newlands Bus Service, which is owned by Transdev. You've got User Bus. They've got 9-year contracts. They can't just be told, oh, you got 90 days and we're going to cut your contract. You can't do that. It's basically, it's like, it's the only industry where it's like, you can be sloppy and get away with it.
The worst part too, right, is like, look, it's not that difficult to find another job, but like getting kicked out of your home is honestly a lot more disruptive.
Oh, especially when you've got to sit there and try to manage rental viewings around your job.
100%.
And like here's something worth noting: the limit on how much to get a bond from Wins without manager's approval is $600. That was the limit in the 80s. Before we were all born.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.